Good evening, everyone. Maswera Bwanji from Malawi, the warm heart of Africa. Welcome to Unlocking Nature, our online campfire. Unlocking Nature is brought to you by the LCA, Leadership for Conservation Africa and Share Screen Africa. My name is Dr. Sela Malanga, and I am your host tonight. With me is my co-host, Dr. Kirsten Neke. Today, we are going to talk about warthogs and sassaflies. But let me tell you a secret. My favorite animal in the bush is not an elephant, not a lion, but a warthog. I found warthogs to be very dramatic, and the young people have nicknamed them Kasongo. Kasongo, which means problems in Ugandan language. These animals, they don't love peace. You will go on a game drive, and you'll see a warthog standing just beside the road perfectly. It will wait and wait until the car is just inches away. That's when it will make a decision. Now is the perfect time for me to go. It will run for its life with its tail up like a radio antenna. And some people call them land cruisers just because of the way they land. And then after a few minutes, it will stand and wonder, why am I running? Where am I going to? And one more thing about the warthogs is they're the only animals that kneel to have their lunch. Like the way you can see behind me there, it has knelt and it's eating. Yeah, when it comes to sassaflies, I've known them since I was young as notorious insects. And as a vet who's so passionate about zoonotic diseases, I look at them as pests. And today I'm looking forward to learning more about the relationship of the two. To understand the relationship between the tsetse and the warthog, we have to go back to the research done in 1960s. And there is no one better than our speaker, our guest of speaker today, Dr. Professor David Cumming, to tell the story. Professor David is someone who is so passionate about conservation. Having met him last week, I was so impressed of the work that he has done. I was so impressed that he chose to study warthogs. He didn't go for elephants. One story that stood out for me in our chat was that he once competed for the position of the chairperson against his own son. And that brought his son back home. Professor David, I am so happy to share the screen with you tonight. So before you share, you go into the presentation, I just want you to share with us. I've shared my story about the warthog, my experience with the warthogs, but I know you have spent so much time with them. I would love to hear from you. What are some of the funniest experience you have had with the warthog?
Okay, thank you, Sela. One of them that comes to mind is that McSweeney, the first baby warthog we reared, when he became sexually matured, decided to court one of our members of staff. And so I was able to film, and I'll show you some of the positions that he took.
Wow.
Was able to film on 16mm film as he wandered along behind my member of staff who was just walking slowly in front of him. And the warthog was chanting away. And of course, we all watched this for quite a while. And that was one of the quite surprising moments. Of course, having been reared by humans, he was firmly imprinted on humans. And of course, later on, when he got even older, became quite aggressive, and we had to send him off to the bush somewhere.
Oh, this is the reason why they are my favorite animals. They have a lot. Warthogs, they're so interesting with things. Thank you so much for sharing that with us.
Okay, briefly, I started off after graduating from Rhodes University as a fisheries research officer, but that wasn't going anywhere. I desperately wanted to get on with some research. I then left that, and while I was looking around for research, took on a temporary teaching job. And so I taught for a year and a half before joining national parks as a research officer at the end of 1964. Again, making it very clear that I really wanted to get on with some serious research. So I was then sent off unexpectedly to one of the most remote field stations in the country, at Sengwa Gorge. Our residence was just above this gorge. It's a 500-meter channel through sandstone. And in places, if one's brave, one can jump across from one side to the other. And of course, the little road bridge across was cement on top of a car chassis, and that was the bridge across the Sengwa River. Anyway, I was sent there to set up an initial research project, which was to do for 18 months, build a temporary setup made up of prefabricated tin houses and rooms and so on, and ended up living there for 12 years. After I'd been there for 18 months, my wife, Meg Cumming, also a Rhodes graduate in zoology and entomology, joined me, and together we got on with working on warthogs, which were the primary host of tsetse fly, as I'll explain later on in the talk. So that's what led me into working on warthogs.
Thank you so much, Prof. And I can say it's a perfect couple with your wife, with the same field, working on the same things. That's quite interesting.
Just an outline, I'll give background and context to the research. I've already alluded to some of it, and just point out that there are two species of warthog in Africa, two species of tsetse flies and trypanosomiasis in Zimbabwe, and then some history of what prompted Game-Tsetse research in the 1960s. I'll then talk about the research area, some notes on methods for studying warthogs and tsetse flies, some experiments, results and implications for tsetse control, and then deal mainly with warthog behaviour. First of all, southwards in the African tropical region, there are 5 different southwards, ranging from giant warthogs to 2 species of warthogs, a bush pig, and 2 species of bush pigs, actually. What's emerged recently is that the warthogs in Somalia and northern Kenya are now referred to as the desert warthog. They are closely related, a subspecies of Phacocaris ethiopicus, which is the extinct Cape warthog, which lived in the southwestern corner of Africa. And then, of course, the common warthog, which is very widely distributed across West Africa, the Sahel, Eastern Africa, and Southern Africa. I should mention that wild boar, the British European wild boar, has been introduced into several countries and become a major pest. For some reason or other, I'm sure there have been attempts to introduce it into Africa, but it hasn't survived. So that I guess our predators have taken care of that. Tsetse fly in Zimbabwe, there are 2 species, Glossina morsitans and Pelidipes, primarily woodland and savanna habitats, but they're very sensitive to temperature, and the tsetse flies in the Zambesi Valley, with climate change, populations there have recently been declining. There's a very interesting paper published on this by John Hargrove. Diseases spread are Ngana or Ngana of livestock and sleeping sickness in humans, again by different species of trypanosome. The sleeping sickness in humans in this part of the world doesn't really create sleeping sickness in the sense that people become very sleepy and stressed for long periods of time, because the trypanosome brucei rhodesiense will kill people within a couple of weeks, a very serious infection. Unfortunately, very few cases still emerge. Wild animals have what I refer to as a fragile immunity to trypanosomes. When white rhino were introduced from Natal into the Zambesi Valley in Mtuzadona National Park, they died of trypanosomiasis. And there was also an eland transferred to Lusulu, which was a research station adjacent to the Sengwa area. which in the translocation was quite badly stressed, also died of trypanosomes. So although wild animals carry the trypanosomes and very few of them seem to be affected by it, it is still a fragile immunity. Adult females mate once after emerging from a pupa. They produce a single egg in utero, and this is what's unusual about them. The larva grows in the uterus and after 9 days is deposited, and that's the picture on the right there, deposited on soil, which then the larva then almost immediately burrows into the soil and forms a pupa, which then lasts for 30 days. And the adult then emerges from that, mates, produces the first egg after about 7 to 9 days, and an interval of 50 days between laying an egg and emerging, and the emergence of the first offspring. In 1890, tsetse fly covered about 2/3 of Zimbabwe, and you can see that the tsetse-free zone was only at high altitudes. In 1896, the rinderpest pandemic swept through to southern Africa from East Africa and killed cattle and all the vast numbers of wild bovids. And of course, the tsetse fly starved as a result, and their populations were then reduced by 1900 to a few isolated pockets in the Zambesi Valley mainly. There were isolated pockets down in the southeast, which I don't have mapped here, but I think they were in Mozambique, and there was later a reinvasion to there. And so the tsetse fly recovered from those isolated pockets, and by the 1950s, you can see that line there going up to the thing, and of course then another reinvasion in the southeast from Mozambique. And of course the immediate or almost immediate response was, since rinderpest had reduced tsetse fly populations by eliminating large numbers of wild herbivores, game elimination seemed the obvious answer. And so in 1919 rather, in the Guai Valley, somewhere down here, game elimination started as a means of control, and that continued through into the 1940s, when the limit was there, as you can see it there. And then in 1990, it was way back then, but of course by that stage, tsetse were being eliminated with ground spraying and aerial spraying. There was also another attempt in the late 1960s, 68 in fact, to move and chiefdoms, the Sibungwe area, which is that area up in the north there, this area here, was very sparsely populated. And so 3 chiefdoms were encouraged to move from where they were in an overcrowded communal land in the south of the country into the Sibungwe, with the intention that people once settled there would change the habitats, and that would also change tsetses. And the game elimination corridor was then reduced to this corridor here, which went from Binga there up to the Sanyati over here. Just a summary of that from 1920 game elimination in those 2 areas through to the 1960s, and you can see there the existing game reserves. Chirisa, Sengwa Research Area, which is where the research that I did on warthogs was set up in 1965, and the Chirisa Game Reserve set up in 1968. That was interesting because it was a game reserve set up in the communal lands of Zimbabwe with the intention of providing benefits to the surrounding communities. That then later became incorporated into the Parks and Wildlife Estate as Chirisa Safari Area, but the research area continued as a research area for some years down in the bottom there. So some further history. What prompted research on game tsetse fly relationships? In the 60s, there was a major controversy developed both within the country and also in in the UK on game elimination. And between 1919 and 1923, some 57,000 animals were killed. Those were mainly duiker, warthog, sable, kudu, and impala. In fact, that's an error there. The warthog were the most abundant animals killed, something like 187,000 of them. No, 87,000 of them. Between 1934 and 1958, a further 600,000 animals were killed. And there the dominant species was duiker, warthog, kudu, sable, and impala. And the reason duiker became such a dominant feature in the number of animals killed was that hunters were equipped with spotlights and could hunt at night. And they took out vast numbers of duiker and strangely didn't seem to be having much impression on the duiker population. Then the next major development, which really occurred in the 1950s when Weitz, Glasgow, and Jackson developed techniques to identify which animal a tsetse fly had fed on. This involved tests on blood that had been squeezed onto a filter paper from a fed, recently engorged tsetse fly and was sent to them in the UK. And they were using antigen tests to determine whether the blood had come from a suid, and in most areas that was predominantly warthogs, and which of the various bovids were being fed on, and including elephant. And so that led to a change in the game elimination tactics to only reducing the numbers of 6 species: elephants, buffalo, warthog, bush pig, kudu, and bushbuck. And those were ongoing episodes in that corridor that I showed earlier. There was also a commission of inquiry and additional staff linked to tsetse control and game relations were added to national parks and to the tsetse department. From those results, from the work done by Weitz and others in the UK, blood meals from Sengwa showed that up to 80% were from warthogs. And that really prompted a change in the initial research program from an 18-month project to remove all the species from the Sengwa area, which is the Sengwa Research Area is here, the Tsetse corridors, this whole area all the way around there, and then up to the Sanyati there, in which game elimination was taking place. Excuse me. And so that initial 18-month project was then changed to looking more carefully at the relationships between tsetse fly and warthogs. Also, by 1968, the Chirisa Safari, not the Chirisa Game Reserve as it was then, was formed. And of course, the corridor all the way up to Sanyati was closed. And it was in those areas that the 6 species were being eliminated. The Sengwa Wildlife Research Area, with the tsetse-game fence going down the bottom there, and the northern fence, in fact, came down to the Sengwa River, but there was a gap here into the northern part of Chirisa. Chirisa Game Reserve initially was based on extending a second control area. Animals were going to be eliminated in what became the Sengwa Wildlife Research Area, but the area to the north here in Chirisa was going to act as a control area. However, things changed, and we set up 2 experimental areas within the Sengwa Wildlife Research Area, one 4 square mile area down in the bottom here, which had transects and monitoring of wildlife and also of tsetse flies and blood meals, and another experimental area here, which was where most of the work on warthog home ranges and so on was done, but also collecting off these transects blood meals and estimates of tsetse populations and so on. These transects were walked, in fact, 25 days continuously for 25 days a month, and then everybody went off for 5 or 6 days. It was a very remote field station. There was no point in people taking weekends because there was nowhere to go to. And so staff were able to go home and visit their families and so on. And other staff like myself able to get to town and get resupplies of groceries and all the rest of it. On those transects initially, for several years, there were sightings of game and spoor. So it was a team of 3 people who moved from sunset, from their base here, out along the transect, and then back along the other transect in the morning. These transects really followed the initial work done by Hugh Lamprey in Tanzania, where he set up similar transects to explore habitat selection by various species of game in the Tarangire Game Reserve. So that then led to the change in the project from 18 months to extend the research on Game-Tsetse areas in these 2 experimental areas. A note on methods and resources. There were transect sightings which gave population numbers and trends. In fact, those transects were walked continuously for nearly 30 years. I have the data for the first 11 years that I was there. But sadly, the remaining information got locked up in a Hewlett-Packard type computer and nobody's being able to extract it. Tame free-ranging warthogs formed a major part of it. And the slides down at the bottom, one shows my wife feeding Max Sweeney. That would have been in 1966. She joined me in the mid-1966 at Sengwa. And that was the first of the orphaned baby warthogs that we got. And the second photograph there in the middle shows Max Sweeney and Rosemary, the 2 first orphaned warthogs that we reared, me just scratching their noses. And the photo on the right shows the whole family of tame animals that we had. One was an impala, which we captured in the area. Another was a bush pig, also an orphaned bush pig, and the 2 warthogs. And that gives you a better impression of what Sengwa Gorge was like. This was during the dry season when one could walk down there. Often when it came in flood during the rainy season, of course, you couldn't get anywhere near there. And that shows the Sengwa Gorge, as I mentioned earlier, a 500-meter slice through a sandstone formation. A note on tsetse fly. Transects with black cloth and screens and hand nets were the standard sampling procedure for thing either off an ox, which might have been taken through the bush, and also black screens carried between 2 people and with a fly net. And that also was a means of collecting blood meals for later analysis in the UK. There was an experiment in Nagapandi to the west of Sengwa where selective removal of hosts took place and confirmed that there wasn't a need to eliminate everything, that some species, particularly warthogs, might do that. But the most important development there was the development of mobile attractants and electrical screens and traps. And that was work done by Glenvale, which was a major development, and I'll come back to that later. There were also a team of research assistants. I didn't mention in terms of assistants in Sengwa, I had a team of 16 research assistants, very competent men who were able to record a whole range of issues and things in the field. Catching warthogs. Over about 6 or 7 years, we captured probably in the region of 500 warthogs using a big net with hoops, a game net spread over those hoops. And we would get up at early in the morning, 4 o'clock, and then before sunrise would advance on the hole and push a whole lot of poles into the hole to block it, set up the net, and then wait for the warthogs to emerge. Sometimes that would take all day. On one or two occasions, it lasted over until the following day. And then that then resulted in each animal being weighed, measured, and tagged. And then the whole sounder, often up to 15 animals, in fact, the most we ever caught was about 15, would be released. And that's on a count of 1, 2, 3, and everybody would jump back and let the warthogs run away. This photograph here is an interesting phenomenon. On a few occasions, when an adult boar would come out of the hole, you could hear them sort of running in the tunnel, coming out. They would then scoop up a whole pile of soil so that any lion or leopard waiting to catch them there would get a faceful of dust and perhaps be partially blinded and allow them to run away. And on that occasion, I sat with a camera next to the entrance and managed to catch that film. Also, the first radio collaring to take place in Zimbabwe, at least, with a very simple circuit developed by one John Tester in the United States, was in here with 4 1.5 volt batteries, 2 on either side of the transmitter, with a transmission belt, very durable transmission belt collar, with a band of copper as the aerial, so that formed a loop antenna, which then transmitted a single signal. Each transmitter had a slightly different wavelength, so that we were able to put on several transmitters, each of which was on a separate wavelength, and so identify which animal we were following. Younger animals were collared with what was tennis court marker, plastic, and instead of using a numbering system, which are normal numbers, which are quite easy to misread, we used a set of symbols, and those were put on younger warthogs with the intent that they were temporary collars that wouldn't last too long and avoid any possible strangulation of the animals involved. We also used an air notching system, 1, 2, 4, 7, which allowed us to number up to, I think it was over 100 warthog, with 2-digit figures. And also the radio tracking involved setting up receiving masts on the edge of the escarpment. The research area is fortunately a basin with a surrounding escarpment, and one was able to then set up receiving stations both for warthogs and later for elephants and other species that could beam across the valley and get fixes from two separate stations on where the animal was. The methods used in sampling tsetse flies. The initial and really groundbreaking technique used by Glenvale was to have a 10-gallon black painted 10-gallon tram on a pram with covered in sticky stuff initially, and that would catch the flies. And what he found was that a completely different set of age and sex structure of flies was coming to the bait, so that it then turned out that tsetse flies, in fact, didn't like humans. And when humans were around doing the sampling, you only got really desperate flies coming in to feed or onto whatever bait you had. And these were a succession of baits, which sorry, I'm just trying to get rid of the bottom stuff here. Succession of work which Glenvale later did at Rakomachi Field Station in the Zambesi Valley. I have got a photograph of his original tram line of the one thing, but couldn't scan it in the last couple of days. So that's a man walking, and the additional thing which he developed on this was, instead of using sticky stuff, he had a grid of electrified wires so that they were spaced such that when a tsetse tried to land on the bait, it got zapped with a shock and fell into a tray below, so that there's a tray below each of these. And also, later in the Zambesi Valley, he he put several cattle, several oxen, I presume, into a pit, and then blew the odors from the oxen out, and that provided an odor trail, which then brought tsetse flies in, and these are the electrical screens all around that, which then allowed him to examine all the flies that were coming in. And that electrification was work that was done later at Rakomachi. And this is Desmond Lovemore, who was the initially a chief glossonologist in the tsetse and trypanosomiasis control branch of the veterinary services, and then later director of the tsetse branch, with a target. These are the screens which Glenvale then developed, plus several other researchers, a canister of ox odor, which was then, or simulated ox odor, which included acetone and a few other chemicals, which then brought tsetse fly in along an odor trail to land on a insecticide, I think pyrethroids, coated screen. And these were became known as targets and were widely deployed as a trap to reduce tsetse population numbers. This is the fence on the boundary of the 4 square mile area, the 4 square mile area that I mentioned earlier. The fence was a low fence which allowed just about anything other than warthogs to go in and out of the area. And the plan was that we would monitor what happened within that 4 square mile area for a year, and then catch and remove all the warthogs. We weren't able to catch them all, so some had to be shot, and then see how that affected the blood meal situation. And this is the blood meals in warthogs, up to nearly 90% there, going all the way down to very low levels. These continuing levels here, after all the warthogs had been removed, were possibly flies moving in from the surrounding area. What happened then was that the flies then moved onto elephant, and that was the blood meals from elephant. And then we had to chase the elephants out of there, which proved extremely difficult. They just wouldn't cross this fence line, even though we'd taken the fence down and were driving them here. When they got here, they would just turn back, and a couple of elephants, unfortunately, had to be killed. And then the other animal, which then became the major host, was kudu. And so those were bovid blood meals. And that indicated or provided pretty sound evidence on what happened when you successively withdrew prime hosts of tsetse fly from their ability to feed on them. Back to warthogs again. The transects provided estimates of animal numbers, and this graph shows the increasing population, which was they were increasing at about 20% per annum. The area before it became a protected area was, of course, hunted, and there was poaching there. Then the population declined at about minus 54% during that decline. And I think there were possibly two reasons. One was that by this time, there were indications of density-dependent regulation occurring in the population, reduced farrowing percentages, reduced numbers of young being produced, but also predation by lions. The lion population had recovered and became focused on warthogs at this stage. And that then kept the numbers down at this low level. Growth rate of 20% per annum and decline of 54%. And this indicated changes in the numbers of young being produced and so on. The transects also provided information on habitat preferences, and with the highest densities occurring in Mapani flays, these were areas that had a lot of Digitaria melangiana, which was one of the rhizomes that warthogs favored. This was in acacia grewia woodland, riparian on the Lutopi River, a very nice woodland there at one time before elephants effectively destroyed it. Going down through a range of other habitats, and the least preferred habitat was Baffia, Bikia, bushland and woodland, which was at one end of one of the transects. The transects were deliberately sited to take in the full katina from the escarpment areas down through to the river valleys. The other aspect of warthogs was their seasonal changes in diet. During the rainy season, they grazed, but also towards the end of the rainy season, a very marked focus on grass seeds, and these warthogs are busy shredding grass seeds off Euroclose grasses. These are baby warthogs grazing. I was able to get the warthogs to go into the back of a Land Rover, take them to various habitats within the research area, and see how they fed in those different habitats, and recording feeding minutes as we watched them. There's two of my Game Scouts research assistants with me photographing the warthogs, and there are two young warthogs grazing, and this is one of the tame warthogs feeding on rhizomes, particularly Tristachia superba, which provided pretty tough rhizomes, which warthogs would scoop out with their noses. One of the big differences between warthogs and bush pigs is that warthogs have a pretty effective snout at rooting for rhizomes, whereas bush pigs are not able to do that at all. The other thing is that bush pigs don't kneel at all like warthogs do on their elbows. And our tame bush pig every now and again would kneel down and wonder what on earth he was doing. And he was obviously copying the warthogs. The other really quite surprising aspect about warthogs is the incredible range of body temperature. Salz and Phelps have found a 3.9 degree centigrade diurnal range in body temperature in a 6-month-old warthog, but not an equivalent variation in a bush pig, similar age bush pig. And we then measured the body temperatures of Grace and Melody during 7 days in June, which was measured at intervals through the day and is shown opposite. And here we have the range of body temperatures over that week, the air temperatures over that week, and the percentage of time spent in various activities. That was when they were in the hole, in their holes in the morning and the evening. The open spaces were when they were feeding and when they were resting. And this resting in shady places during the day has implications for their the access of tsetse flies to warthogs. We also measured the body temperatures of 33 warthogs captured at holes, and these varied between 33.9 and 40.8%, 80 degrees centigrade, with a range again of 6.9, nearly 7 degrees centigrade range in body temperatures. And the implications of some of this, baby warthogs in captivity require a hot water bottle. Otherwise, they will die of hypothermia during the night. And even a 1-year-old warthog requires a hole to sleep in. And we discovered this when we were catching warthogs from the 4 square mile area and holding them in a pen before they were translocated to Kyle Game Reserve. And 2 young warthogs, a year old, ended up with hypothermia in the early hours of the morning. And despite our attempts to warm them up, again, there'd obviously been brain damage during the night. And so after that, any warthogs that were kept were able to get into that were captured, and before translocation were able to get into a hole and keep warm. And that shows baby warthogs in the bottom there, in their so-called hole. It was a little box in the house. It was very fortunate in that the prefab house that we lived in for 7 years was such that it was okay for warthogs to wander in through the house, and even the impala to come into the house and move around in there. It's something that wouldn't have happened if we'd had a smart modern house. Moving on to holes, which are so important in the lives of warthog. In areas where there are no holes, as happened in Baines Kloof Little Game Reserve outside Grahamstown, they end up using the, what are they called? The channels under roads. And so those provided a hole for them. But we also, in trying to test the later work on the formation of clans within warthog social systems, developed artificial warthog holes, and those are the designs, one with a bent straight channel going in, one with a bent channel, and one with 2 channels. And this shows the construction of the artificial warthog holes. And 6 of those were deployed, 2 on each of the boundaries between the clans that we had identified. And that again was in the experimental area. These are some diagrams of a range of warthog holes. One of the major holes, which took pretty large sounders, were in sodic soil areas with subterranean erosion gullies. And those would be quite extensive and sometimes hold quite large sounders of warthogs. This one here we waited for nearly 24 hours for the warthogs to come out of this. And in the end, went into the main chamber. I don't remember quite how we determined exactly where that was. But interestingly, the warthogs in there were completely cataleptic, in the same way that so many other animals, when they're scared, sort of bluff they're dead. And it was very difficult to get them to move and to come out of that hole. Social organization of warthogs, they're essentially a matriarchal-based system where you've got female warthogs, often an older mother with younger females with her, and of course with baby warthogs with her. And you have then surrounding that, sort of in the periphery of your matriarchal sounders, and in the Sengwa area, those would be producing young in the beginning of the beginning of the rainy season, September, October, and mating occurred in April, May. And adult males would be in and out of sanders. There are often statements that a sander of warthogs comprises an adult male and an adult female. The adult males are only very temporarily with them and mostly wander around on their own, sometimes in groups of 2 or 3. And then, of course, the bachelor groups, the younger warthogs, get kicked out of the sander. The males get kicked out of the sander after the first year, so that you then have young sanders of yearlings with 3 or 4 young males wandering around, often sometimes looking a little bit lost. This is one of our tame warthogs, I think Rosemary, with 4 young. One of the interesting things about warthogs is that each piglet has its own teat. And when one of them dies, as happened on 2 occasions, when one of the little warthogs fell into the gorge, that teat dries up, and they only carry on feeding on the remaining 3. Warthogs also groom each other. They very often have nits in their mane from fleas, and warthogs will groom those. And in fact, they do this very gently. I've had them grooming the hair on my arms and just pulling at them. And also warthogs scent mark, and this turned out to be a new discovery of scent glands in the lips, which are wiped there, but also there's a damp patch in front of the eye, which is also rubbed on things. And that work on the glands was done with Dick Estes, who analyzed the histology and so on. I didn't have the histological equipment to do it. And we published a joint paper on the scent glands in warthog lips, which also led to finding similar glands in domestic pigs, which hadn't been described before. And there are also Mike Jones, a colleague, found lip glands in bush pig. With the tame warthogs, I was able to take quite a lot of film on 16mm film, which is not something one has these days, of their various aspects of their behavior. And here are 2 warthogs sparring. And what's interesting is how they sort of attack each other. And this partly explains why they have warts. Those warts form a protection above the muscles that manipulate the snout, and also at the back, the masseter muscles at the back that work the jaws. And in many ways, these are equivalent to the equipment which boxers use when they're sparring, those protective head caps. So that partly explains why, given the way they fight, why warthogs have those warts there. And when you compare that with a bush pig, which is a very different way of fighting, they sort of clash their elongated snouts together, and there are also warts there to protect them. As I mentioned in the opening remarks that I made, Max Sweeney was courting one of the members of staff, and this was his gait when he was walking with his tail up like this, but also chanting away as he went. It's referred to as a chantecour and is very obvious when warthogs are courting. As I mentioned earlier, we radio tagged numbers of animals and also were able to record which holes they were in, which holes they were using. What I didn't mention when talking about warthog holes and capture was that in the evening, when we were going to mount a capture operation, scouts would watch a number of holes from a tree nearby the hole, and I would then drive down in the evening and discuss with them which holes had been used, which animals, what the sounder size was, and so on. And then we would plan which holes we would catch warthogs at in the following morning. And that meant getting up at about 4 o'clock in the morning and rushing up to the hole with poles, blocking it, and then setting up the net. And so that provided information on what holes the tagged warthogs were using, and these were their home ranges, which are quite small. The grid there is a 1 square kilometre grid, and that provides information, and there's several bits of information and very detailed analysis of who was using what hole and where and when, to arrive at the hypothesis that warthogs were dispersed in clans. These are home ranges for adult males, which are a bit bigger, but also not very good records on which holes they used. Sometimes it was clear that very large adult males could stay out at night on a warm night. These are the holes which were used by the different clans, and again, quite clearly, animals within this clan using this range of holes, and only occasionally maybe moving out. And it was on these boundaries that we placed the artificial warthog holes. And here we have the sightings of radio-tagged female warthogs in the different clan areas. And that turned out to be fairly clear. I should mention that this matriarchal sounders and clans is also something that occurs in elephants. So what are the links between warthogs and tsetse flies? Warthogs are the smallest of the bearskin large herbivores. You've got elephants, rhinos, and then down to warthogs. And in warthogs, the skin is in fact quite thin. They don't have a fat layer like domestic pigs have. They're very lean and I guess easily fed on by tsetse flies. Both tsetses and warthogs are diurnal, and during the day they rest in similar places. Work by Bob Pilson and his wife did some very interesting work on where tsetses were resting during the day, and that provided a baseline for ground spraying, which then focused on riverine areas and the sorts of places that tsetse fly would rest, and also spraying into warthog holes. The flies also seem to have similar habitat preferences in terms of riparian areas and drainage lines. Having a little group of 2 warthogs and an impala and a bush pig, it was quite clear why impala formed such a small percentage of the blood meals that were being collected. And it was because impala have an extremely sensitive skin, and any fly landing on them, there's immediately skin shivering, which would keep the fly at bay, the tsetse fly at bay. And I've even seen mosquitoes get frightened off or shed away when they've landed on an impala's leg. That's something that I don't know why has never been published, and perhaps it was an observation that we should have published at the time. And it was these sorts of comparisons between warthogs and tsetse and the blood meal story that led Glyn Vale to set up a black 10-gallon sticky drum on a pram, and draw that along 100 meters, and then examine what flies had come to the mobile warthog. And that initial small but very important step then led to the development of odor-baited traps and targets, with the result that game elimination and bush clearing are now largely redundant and in controlling tsetse fly. Grinvale's research was groundbreaking research at the time, and he published it, the initial findings, in a quite small paper in Arnoldia, the publication by the museum in Zimbabwe, or it was Rhodesia at the time. It also led to the work being done there, also led to the establishment of Chirisa Game Reserve in 1968 and the Hosties Nickel Wildlife Research Institute, which is the building shown below there on the left, which was opened in 1972. That later was changed to the Sengwa Wildlife Research Institute, which had links with the University of Zimbabwe. That also had facilities and office space to provide for visiting research workers, as well as for the resident ecologist and resident zoologist, probably, and the resident botanist, who were responsible for maintaining the ongoing monitoring and so on. And also, the development of that research area and that research station led to extending Chizarira National Park down into the Zambesi Valley and linking it with Chirisa Game Reserve. And of course, there's been ongoing wildlife research in the Sengwa Wildlife Research Area. And that's a portrait of Macintosh, one of our tame warthogs, and you can see there the wet patch in front of the eyes and the clear position of the warts. His warts, rear warts here under the eye, have still got to be developed, and the one protecting the masseter muscles that go down to the snout from there. So thank you very much. I'm very happy to take any questions you may have. Thank you. I'm not sure if I initially thanked both Kirsten for inviting me to talk about warthogs and Merit for her excellent work on my slides, which greatly improved them. So thank you to both of you. I should have mentioned that right at the start.
Thank you so much, Prof. Thank you so much. This was a very interesting talk. Like when I first saw the topic, I was like, okay, warthogs and tsetse. You know, there are two different animals. I was wondering, how does a tsetse keep up with a busy animal like a warthog? You know, it needs to sting it and to bite it to get like blood feed. But then I was wondering, how does it keep up with this busy animal? But your presentation has helped me understand that they share the habitat and the similarities between them. Now it makes so much sense. And it's quite very interesting to learn that each baby, I should call it a piglet. Yeah, the piglet, that each one has their own teeth. That's very interesting. Thank you so much. I've learned a lot. And one more thing that I've learned, your presentation has helped me to understand how important it is to understand the host when it comes to these diseases, zoonotic diseases and everything in the bush. You know, they tried, or it all came from far away, trying to eliminate animals, but then the answer was in finding which was the host. Yeah, so this is quite very interesting. I'm wondering, you talked about how sensitive the warthogs are to temperature change, and I'm wondering if you're aware of any changes to warthogs or healthy in regard to the climate change that we're experiencing now. How is it affecting the warthogs?
The short answer is I don't know, and I don't think anybody's examined that. I don't think seems to have been very little recent research in the last couple of decades on warthogs.
Yeah.
I should have mentioned that Angela White, who's now in America, did some very interesting work on the social organization of warthogs in Shluy-Umfolozi in Natal, and that also confirmed the clan formation, or the formation of clans in warthogs there. But warthogs, in relation to temperature, seem to be able to cover a wide range of habitats, and Somalia, in these almost desert-like situations, it can get very cold at night.
Yeah.
I've tried to encourage physiologists to have a look at what this temperature variation is. I suspect it's something to do with water conservation, and that there might have been a period when warthogs and the two species separated about 1 million years ago, actually, that they may need to be able to allow their body temperature to fluctuate without spending energy on maintaining the body temperature that so many mammals keep within very narrow ranges. And that an examination of their physiology in relation to temperature and water relations and so on may be very interesting, and something that it would be very interesting to do.
Thanks, Stella, and thank you very much, Professor Cumming. I've really enjoyed your presentation. Very, very special research that you've done over your life. And I would like to just refer back to, you mentioned in the same mouthful, warthogs, elephants, and matriarchs, or matriarchal system. Can you explain that a little bit more?
The dominant sort of social aspect in elephants is that you have a matriarch, often an old female, with successive generations of her young, forming a small herd, if you like, and related herds. And it's become clear from work in East Africa that in fact elephants will form clans. Some of the work done by Rowan Martin and Sengwa on tracking elephants also suggested that we could identify the areas in which elephant clans were operating in the Sengwa area in terms of the distribution of their home ranges and so on. And bull elephants, male elephants, and young males get kicked out of the herd quite early, and often there's a lot of screaming by elephants when that's happening. So that, and as in warthogs, after the first year, the young males get kicked out. And again, that forms these rather loose, but nevertheless clearly defined units, which we can refer to as clans. Sorry, Kirsten, does that answer your question?
I was just wondering, I don't know if maybe it was just me misunderstanding, but so the warthogs don't have a matriarchal system at all.
The warthogs do.
They do. Oh, sorry, I thought you. Okay, I got it now. Thank you.
Yeah, no, they very definitely do. And a sounder and a series of sounders will often be an older adult female with other females which were previously her progeny, and their young moving around together. Warthog sounders sell more than about 5, maybe up to 10 animals. But those related groups will form or be dispersed, would probably be a better word, as a clan in a particular area.
Okay, got it. Thank you so much. Thanks, Stella. Over to you again.
Thank you, Kirsten. I have one more question for you, Professor. If you were to design a CC controls program today, what would you do differently? What, according to what you've learned from your past work?
Okay, I wasn't involved in deciding on any tsetse control programs. That was done by the entomologists and the Department of Tsetse and Trypanosomiasis Control. But John Hargrove has written a very useful summary of tsetse control, not only in Zimbabwe, but also in East Africa. And he has pointed out that generally there's a need to have a combination of things. Targets are very good at holding a particular boundary, if you like, to the tsetse thing, but don't always do so well at getting rid of tsetse flies. And within Zimbabwe, the two major techniques being used are, one, the use of targets to hold boundaries, like on the northeastern boundary of Zimbabwe and Mozambique. to prevent reinvasion. One of the big problems with tsetse eradication is that you can get rid of tsetses in an area, but if there are neighboring areas that have still got tsetse, you still face a reinvasion problem. And the other very effective mechanism is spraying, I think it's pyrethroid insecticides, on the legs of cattle. Initially they sprayed them on the bodies of cattle, but what transpired was that the dung being produced by animals with systemic insecticide in them, the dung being produced by them was killing dung beetles. And that was again work that Glenvale did. But then they found that if you sprayed just the legs, that was equally effective at reducing tsetse numbers, but didn't produce pyrethroids in the dung, or at least much less in the way of that. So that didn't affect the dung beetle fauna. And those seem to be the two major aspects. But John Hargrove has got a summary of the sort of 4 or 5 major tsetse control methods, and pointed out that really no single method will work on its own, and it's often a combination of a couple. Of course, one of the things I didn't mention is that the tsetse flies were eradicated from Sengwa by ground spraying in 1970, and that caused Glenvale and crowd to move to the Zambesi Valley at Rakomachi. But also there was aerial spraying. On winter nights, when you got cold air going down, planes flying over just above tree height, actually, pretty dangerous. And that was used to drive tsetse north of the Chirisa Game Reserve.
Good evening. David, thank you for the presentation. I'm based in Bloemfontein with the University of the Free State, and we have one of the colleagues that did a small project with honor students on some of the warthogs just in one of the small reserves there. Can you tell us also something about the interaction of other animals that shares the burrows with the warthogs?
Oh, yes. Interestingly, on several occasions, warthogs and porcupines were using the same hole. And on at least one occasion, in one of those large erosion gully holes, it was being shared with a hyena, which was somewhat surprising, but it happened and doesn't seem to have had any adverse effect on the warthogs or on the hyena.
Very interesting.
But of course, there are also a whole lot of insects, tampans and other things which you get in warthog burrows. So crawling around in a warthog burrow can end up with bites from a whole lot of things.
Thanks very much for a very interesting talk. I've just got one comment and a question. I didn't quite catch what you said about the warthogs and burrows, but I had a student, Mark Anderson, studying aardvarks, and he was looking at body temperature, or one of the features was looking at body temperature and temperature of burrows underground. And aardvarks actually do fluctuate their body temperature a couple of degrees and sort of lower the metabolic rate while they're underground. But a very interesting thing was that I think over the whole year, at about 1 meter underground, the variation in temperature is about 13 to 16 degrees. So it's a very stable environment, not very far below the ground. And then there's a question, maybe a silly one.
Yes, thank you for that. That's a
For
very
about
interesting
6 years
observation.
in the Zambesi Valley. And the tsetses prefer my wife very much more to me, and she wants to know why. If you have an explanation.
I guess it may be to do with tsetse's very sensitive sense of smell and odor, and that maybe males smell differently from females, and hence they're lawful females. That would be my guess as to what it might be.
Thank you for the presentation. I really enjoyed it. 2 questions, if I may. What is the maximum age, do you think, of a warthog? Obviously, it depends what happens to it. And given their life cycle, would you consider that tsetse flies are slow breeders compared to something like mosquitoes? Thank you.
I think living in the the maximum age of warthogs in the wild is probably in the region of 14, 15 years. But I doubt if very many of them get to that. In terms of their life cycle, tsetse flies have what is often referred to as a K type life cycle, where it is in fact very slow. And as Stephen Torr, one of the group of people who's continuing to do research on tsetse issues, points out that because of that slow breeding cycle, which, as I pointed out, takes over sort of 50 days between hatching an egg and coming out as an adult. One of the things of that is that by taking out 2% per day of the female population can lead to the elimination of tsetse flies. So compared with mosquitoes that lay lots of eggs in ponds and lots of larvae grow there and many animals come out, and a much more rapid turnover in terms of the population, that's a different issue. I hope that provides some sort of answer to your question. Okay, one of the things I should add is that one of the gaps is in developing aging criteria for warthogs. I developed pretty effective field aging criteria to distinguish between young warthogs, yearling warthogs, subadult warthogs, and adult warthogs. But in terms of getting the ages and the thousands of skulls in museums all over the place, and at Sengwa we collected a vast number of skulls from lion kills, is aging from their teeth. Clive Spinach provided an aging criteria many years ago, but in fact it doesn't work. At least it didn't work for warthogs in this part of the world. And there's a need to develop effective warthog aging criteria that you can use the skull and the teeth to age an animal. Rather like elephants, warthogs have a succession of molar teeth that come through one after the other. And then, of course, when the last molar comes through, like elephants, they end up not being able to chew their food once that's worn out.
How's it? Thanks very much for the talk. Yeah, it was very interesting. I think we all learned a lot of stuff about warthogs and tsetse flies that we didn't know. I mean, living in South Africa, I think many of us are fairly unfamiliar with tsetse flies. But we actually spent about 3 weeks in Zambia in October last year, and we started experiencing tsetse flies firsthand, which was quite interesting. And just to add maybe some further twist to Phil Richardson's question, or about whether they like men or women, they definitely preferred to bite me to my wife. So that kind of puts that on its head. I don't know whether I smell like a woman or what, but they loved eating me. But yeah, just sort of on a maybe slightly more serious, the tsetse flies, are they similar to like a mosquito, that it's not actually a mosquito, it's the parasite inside the mosquito that causes the malaria? The sleeping sickness and the relationship between sleeping sickness and tsetse flies, because I mean we were bitten frequently but didn't get sick. I mean, to what extent is the sleeping sickness part of the whole tsetse fly thing eradicated, even though the tsetse flies aren't eradicated?
Okay, what tsetse flies are transmitting in their while feeding is trypanosomes. So that the trypanosomes that they pick up from wild animals, and there's several species of trypanosomes, would be what they're transmitting. And most wild animals are not clinically affected by Trypanosoma brucei, Gambiensis, I think it is. Whereas if they have picked up, and this seems to be possibly from bushbuck, is Trypanosoma brucei rhodesiense. That particular trypanosome, if that's injected into you by a tsetse fly, they inject that from their saliva. The trypanosome gets introduced into you. If that particular species, subspecies of trypanosome gets into you, that will make you very sick. And in fact, Des Lovemore picked up that sleeping sickness on a visit to Chobe, and had a very serious time being treated with heavy metals to get rid of the trypanosome. It's not an easy thing to sort out. And in fact, quite close to where the Sengwa area is, there's the Buzi River, which runs between Chisarira and Chirisa, runs into the Sengwa River. In 1916, the people living in the Buzi Valley had to be evacuated because they were dying from sleeping sickness.
So, I mean, is there any kind of way to stop that? I mean, the tsetse flies seem to be almost indestructible. They keep coming back once you sort of stop. But the trypanosomes in the animals, is there any way to kind of clear them, or is that just part of nature and it'll never ever go away?
No, at least I don't see any method to do that. People have been trying to develop vaccines against trypanosomes, but they're extremely difficult. Extremely difficult.
It's a bacteria or a virus?
It's a no, it's not a virus. It's a protozoan.
Okay.
With flagella and so on. It's a very distinctive sort of microbe.
Okay. And then the last thing, again, it was a more fun observation. I mean, we were driving through Kafui National Park and we thought, shame, someone's lost their T-shirt hanging in the tree there. And then you drive a bit further and then there's another piece of cloth hanging in the tree. And it's like, what is all this type of stuff going on there? And then when we asked one of the rangers, then they told us. But yeah, I mean, it's quite interesting how many of those blue, black, like almost looks like a bit of a Botswana flag kind of thing going on there, but it's obviously in another country. And we thought they were flags. We weren't exactly what they were, but all of those pieces of cloth treated with that muti to get the flies. So quite interesting. Thank you.
Those are now referred to as targets, and that would have been part of their efforts to control tsetse flies. There need to be about 4 targets per square kilometer rather, to have any serious effect on tsetse. One of the big problems with targets is the logistical efforts to maintain them and replace them, but also the cloth gets stolen. So that's been a major problem in some areas.
Yeah, thank you very much, David. I think we know about each other, but we don't know each other. But I'm absolutely fascinated about what you were telling us about the body temperature, because we're doing a lot of research work on anesthetics in warthogs, and especially to look at the control of African swine fever in other continents where they don't want it and they want to test animals. And it's one of the things that we have found is that we can actually never, like in other animals, start off with a normal body temperature and then look at the trends that are happening under anesthesia, because when we start with the anesthesia, the body temperature is all over the place. Have you found any correlation between activity and body temperatures, or were these body temperatures that you recorded from the pigs that came out of the burrows, or animals that have been passively kept there?
Thanks, Corbus. Yes, it's a long time since we've interacted. A very long time, actually. If you look at that well, looking at that graph of the daily fluctuation body temperature from the tame warthogs that we looked at, there was an inflection. The body temperature was going up and then it sort of leveled off at midday when the warthogs were resting. So there was some adjustment in body temperature when they were resting in the middle of the day, but then it continued to climb up. And I guess they try and get as warm as they can before they retreat to their holes. And then once in their holes, once there are a whole lot of them there, of course that raises the raises the air temperature and keeps them warm through the night. But it's interesting that having to deal with immobilizing them with drugs, that the body temperature issue is so important.
Thank you, David. It's been a long time since we spoke also when we were working on the AHEAD program. I just wanted to ask you about the tension between tsetse fly control and conservation of wilderness areas, because if there are no tsetses, then people move their cattle in.
Yes, there is. And there was an ongoing debate. I'm not sure that it's still alive, that by removing tsetse, one was, as you say, opening up the area for human settlement. And this certainly happened in the Sibongwe. The population went from, I forget the exact figures, but between 1972 and 1992, over 20 years, the change in area that was being cultivated and settled in the Sibongwe area changed dramatically. And obviously the wildlife in that area then went. You had a very rich wildlife fauna in the Sibongwe. And in fact, the whole campfire program of community benefits from wildlife developed initially in the Sibongwe because there was such a rich wildlife there. But now that's pretty well gone. And even in Choriza, more recently, the level of poaching and so on has greatly reduced some of those populations. So yes, there was certainly an ongoing debate. I haven't been aware that it's still going on, but by getting rid of tsetse fly, you're opening up to the introduction of large numbers of livestock, which of course has conservation consequences. But then the whole tsetse problem and the diseases the disease that they transmit is still a major problem right across Africa where tsetse occur.
Thank you so much, Emily. Yeah, I think the question is a good way of ending the session. And as we were preparing for this talk, one of my friends said, thanks to tsetse, I was able to see animals, wild animals. I asked him, what do you mean? Did they bite you so much that you didn't concentrate? He was like, no, because of tsetse, that's why we have all the animals. Without tsetse, people would have brought in a lot of cows and wouldn't have what we have now. And that just reminded me, there is always a good in the bad, and there's always a bad in the good. So thanks to tsetse, we are sitting here and discussing conservation. Yeah, so with that note, I would like...
Very interesting point that Emily raised, and one that probably needs much further debate than it's getting at the moment.
Yes. Yeah. And with that, I would like to thank you so much, Professor David Cumming. It was a nice session, and we have really learned a lot from you.